Hello and welcome to the Middle East Report. In this program today, we will be discussing the Zionist Federation's campaign to prescribe the Iranian Revolutionary Guards as a terrorist organization. To date, the British government and the European Union has not recognized the Iranian Revolutionary Guards' role in international terrorism and therefore has not classified them as a terrorist organization. And it's important to understand in this war against international terrorism that we understand the Iranian Revolutionary Guard's role in supporting terror groups like Hezbollah and Hamas, and also how the Iranian Revolutionary Guards are playing a key role in supporting President Bashar al-Assad of Syria in his bloody crackdown on the rebels in Syria, which has already claimed the lives of over 90,000 Syrians and has led to 1.5 million Syrians being exiled. So in this program today, we'll be making the case for why the Iranian Revolutionary Guards should be prescribed as a terrorist organization and why the British government and the European Union need to take matters urgently and quickly to classify the IRGC as a terrorist organization. And I'm joined today by Zionist Federation spokesman, Alan Melkman. Alan Melkman, I want to welcome you to the Middle East Report.
Thank you for inviting me.
It's a pleasure. Alan, it would be very interesting for our viewers to know something about your Jewish background and how you got involved in this campaign to prescribe the Iranian Revolutionary Guards as a terrorist organization and your involvement as a spokesman for the Zionist Federation.
Okay, Simon. I'm a secular Jew, brought up in London. The reasons that I've got involved with Israel and countering anti-Israel activity, I suppose, goes back to my early youth. My father used to be an avid reader, and we had lots and lots of books in our house. And one day, I must have been maybe 5, 6, 7 years old, I looked up at the bookcase and there was one book which was sort of light blue and silver cover, which had Israel written on it. And the author was a guy called Melkman, which naturally intrigued me. Anyway, it had been written, we're going back now to the 1950s, so not long after the State of Israel was established. And my father began to talk, although it wasn't written by my father, began to talk about Israel and why we needed Israel. And since the Holocaust was still very, very fresh, the thing that sticks in my mind was when he said, things in England are great for Jews, as they were in Germany and in many, many other countries. But sooner or later, things always go bad. And when things go bad, then it is vitally important to have Israel. If Israel had existed before the war, then 6 million would have been saved. And that made a huge impression on me. And as a result of that, I have always been extremely pro and also defensive of Israel. As I went into business, obviously lots of things occupied my time. Now that I have a bit more time on my hands, I can take up now this passion that I have for Israel, and I find that the activist activity that I'm involved in, associated with the ZF, enables me to try and turn, or at least begin to try to turn the tide of the huge anti-Israel feeling that has arisen since I was a young lad here after the war.
Excellent. And so can you share with our viewers about this Zionist Federation's campaign to proscribe the Iranian Revolutionary Guards as a terrorist organisation, and why does the British and the European Union need to do this?
Well, I think you partly explained it in your introduction. Clearly, the Iranian Revolutionary Guard is part of the state apparatus of Iran. Iran is probably the single biggest threat to world war and disorder generally that exists on the planet. The Iranian Revolutionary Guard Corps, or the IRGC, if I may use those initials, since it's less of a mouthful.
Absolutely.
The IRGC is an arm of the state which is charged with implementing much of the mayhem and havoc that it intends to create. And we can go into more details as our discussion proceeds. However, what is absolutely clear is that unless something is done to stop the ever-increasing influence and impact that the IRGC has, then the West will increasingly, including us here in Britain and including Israel, will be increasingly put on the back foot.
So can you tell us something a little bit more about the IRGC? Why were they established? We know that they were established shortly after Ayatollah Khomeini took power in the Islamic Revolution in '79. But can you tell us something a little bit more about the IRGC?
Sure. As all your viewers probably know, the power in Iran before the Ayatollahs took over was the Shah. The Shah was essentially trying to create a country which was looking to the West, which was progressive, was looking to advance society. He was replaced by the clerical regime of Ayatollah Khomeini through the revolution. That revolution was essentially the opposite of what the Shah was. It was inward-looking, it was Islam-focused, and it was looking backwards rather than forwards. Now, in the early days of the regime, the Ayatollahs, the clerics, did have a problem because the army, which was obviously commanded by the Shah, had large numbers of elements which were still loyal to it. And obviously during the first part of the revolution, the Ayatollahs weren't strong enough. So they created the IRGC, firstly, as a bulwark against the army, a countervailing force. Obviously, over time, they cleaned out the army of the Shah sympathizers and replaced it with their own people. So during the early days, it was there as a countervailing force. The second reason they created it was to defend the Islamic Revolution. And what's important to understand is it wasn't defending just the Iranian Revolution, it was defending the Islamic Revolution. And that is a much, much bigger vision. Obviously, it was charged with stopping regressing back within Iran, but its brief was much, much wider than that. And that gave it the view of looking outside. Now, in terms of that view, what is important to understand is that it looks through the outside world as a sort of prism, through a sort of prism, and neatly divides the world, which I think is probably not a terribly precise division, into the world of Islam, Dar al-Islam, and the world of war. That's everything else, Dar al-Harb. And the world of war is one in which there is conflict with non-Muslims for the installation of an Islamic world. And this battle is what drives them. And the battle is perfectly justified in Islam, as I understand it, when Islam is being threatened. So there is a continual perception of Iran and the revolution being threatened, which is the prism that they look through, that it gives them the justification for the actions that they take, both internally within Iran, within other Muslim countries, and obviously outside of the Muslim world.
Absolutely. I think we also have to emphasize there the importance that the Islamic Republic of Iran, within its religious ideology, is Shia. So it's exporting a Shia interpretation of Islam and trying to impose a Shia Islamic worldview, not only on its people and its citizens, but also around the world, and particularly the Middle East.
But interestingly, that is not stopping it allying itself with Sunni interests around the Middle East.
Absolutely. Can you tell us something more about the political and the religious ideology of the IRGC, and particularly how they enforce policies pursued by the Supreme Leader of Iran, Khomeini?
It's a fundamentalist interpretation of Islam, which they believe to be the true interpretation of Islam. And they are obviously therefore intolerant, as all fundamentalists are, of other interpretations. It's a clerical state. Their job within Iran is to ensure that the religious laws are obeyed. Their job is to ensure, for example, that women dress modestly. Their job is to ensure, as sort of like being auxiliaries to the police, that the laws, Islamic laws, are enforced. For example, stoning for adultery or having limbs amputated, and so on. They are also within Iran were responsible for putting down the so-called green uprising, which you referred to during the last fraudulent elections, at which Ahmadinejad was re-elected. So they provide a very strong arm of the state within Iran itself. Outside Iran, as again you've begun to say, they operate, if you can think of it more like maybe sort of like an octopus, and they have tentacles that spread far and wide, and it is almost difficult to find places on Earth where they are not. Probably the Arctic and Antarctic could be excluded. But if one looks through Africa, South America, Europe, the Middle and Far East, their presence is felt.
And we have a clip to go to now that really does look at the threat posed by the Islamic Republic of Iran. They're state sponsors of international terrorism, which they do this through the IRGC by sponsoring terrorist groups like Hamas and Hezbollah and Palestinian Islamic Jihad. And this clip is called Iranianism.
یک ملت صاحب فناوری هسته‌ای است و کسانی که با ملت ما میخوان حرف بزنند باید بدانند که با کدوم ملت دارن حرف میزنند. اگر هم الان ندانند به زودی مجدداً زمانی که سرشون به سنگ خواهد خورد.
From Tehran to the United Nations in New York, President Ahmadinejad expresses his distaste for America and the international community. Media outlets line up for interviews with a defiant Iranian president, as daily news reports focus on Iran's nuclear program. American and Western leaders have often labeled the Iranian regime a sponsor of terror and a violator of human rights. Yet, for more than 30 years, America has misread the guiding principles of the Islamic Republic. What happens when a regime that openly desires the destruction of nations obtains nuclear weapons? The world may suffer unthinkable consequences. Iran's nuclear program is not an isolated problem. It is the final component of an extreme doctrine that has held Iran's citizens and the international community hostage for more than 30 years. For over 30 years, the regime has used international terror in its struggle to spread Khomeini's revolution.
The Iranian regime has an endless number of proxy organizations, beginning with the big ones, such as Hezbollah.
Founded in the early 80s in Lebanon under the guidance of Ayatollah Khomeini, Hezbollah wasted little time before striking American installations.
The day after this attack on the embassy here in Beirut, the death toll has continued to climb. It is believed that before the counting is over, more than 60 people will be found to have died, at least 16 of them Americans.
Hezbollah's next attack would prove even more deadly, attacking multinational peacekeeping forces stationed in Beirut following Lebanon's civil war.
Despite repeated proclamations that terrorists won't affect U.S. foreign policy, Muslim forces in Lebanon achieve their goal when Reagan withdraws all 1,400 Marines to the safety of offshore ships.
There's clearly a direct connection between the Iranian petroleum and gas industry and its support for global terrorism.
They send that money to Hamas in Gaza, and they send that money to Nasrallah of Lebanon. Hezbollah in Lebanon used to receive $300 million a year. After 2006, according to open sources, they have been receiving close to $1 billion a year. Ahmadinejad narrative is very strange for all of us. He seems from another planet. He talks about a world without America.
امام عزیز فرمودی که باید مستکبرین جهان منهدم شوند و به لطف استمرار خط نورانیت در ولایت و به فضل الهی زنگ شمارش معکوس اضمحلال قدرت اهریمنی آمریکا به صدا در آمده است.
Inception, the Khomeinist regime of Iran was already building what became later its international alliance of the 21st century. By the mid-80s, Iran has already reached the Eastern Mediterranean, Syria, Hezbollah, and as of the 90s, Hamas inside the Palestinian communities. Today, we look at Eastern Arabia, we look at Northern Yemen and Southern Saudi Arabia.
The Iranians have been accused of providing support for the Houthis and using them in a proxy war against Yemen's Sunni Muslim majority.
The way events are moving in this country indicates to us that Iran wants to export the Shia ideology by force.
We look even into Africa, West Africa. We look nowadays into Latin America, from Caracas, from Venezuela, all the way down to Argentina.
We ask the world to respect Iran because they are trying to influence the strength of the Iranian revolution.
The Iranian regime and Hugo Chavez signed strategic treaties. That is a reminder of the Soviet Union and Cuba. We know that the Iranian cells and Hezbollah, their allies, have cells throughout the Western world. So it's really a global reach at this point in time. The Iranian strategy is not necessarily to have Iranian troops occupying these countries. That would be too obvious. With petrodollars, unlike the Soviet Union, the Iranians could go across any border.
China emerged as Iran's top oil export market. Iran provides 300,000 barrels of oil a day to China, generating billions of dollars in revenue.
With the petrodollars pouring in from Iran, that money could create a lot of influences.
پیام انقلاب پیام جهانی است، در جغرافیا و زمان محدود نمی شود. تردید نکنید که ان شاء الله اسلام همه کجا رو فتح خواهد کرد، همه قله های جهان رو فتح خواهد کرد.
Today, the Iranian regime is on the verge of becoming a nuclear power. In 1968, Iran, under the Shah's leadership, signed the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty and began working on a nuclear energy program. With the overthrow of the Shah, the Iranian nuclear program went into remission. At the time, Khomeini didn't value the potential of Iran's energy program, but within a few years, circumstances would change. With well over 500,000 Iranians dead and Khomeini refusing a ceasefire agreement, the regime decided to secretly restart Iran's nuclear program. The details of the program would eventually become the subject of international scrutiny and debate. Iran is one country that may never need another source of energy. Iran is entitled to a nuclear energy program if it abides by its treaty requirements.
The IAEA Director General's latest report once again concludes that Iran is not complying with its IAEA and Security Council obligations.
ما هیچ چیز مخفی نداریم.
We have no secrecy.
و در چارچوب مقررات آژانس کار میکنیم.
And we work within the framework of the IAEA.
How many more lie buried? That's the question for Iran tonight.
Another cause for alarm is Iran's unexplained enrichment of uranium and plutonium, well beyond the levels necessary for a peaceful nuclear energy program.
And Iran is in the news tonight. Nuclear experts have found unexplained traces of plutonium and highly enriched uranium in a nuclear waste facility in Iran.
Iran is enriching uranium, and we don't have any explanation for the use of this enriched uranium.
No matter how many resolutions are passed, Islamic Republic of Iran will not stop its enrichment activities.
You are not going after a nuclear bomb.
Definitely not.
Hate this weapon.
Recently uncovered documents have revealed the development of detonation devices.
The document talks of a 4-year Iranian program to develop a neutron initiator, a highly specialized component of a nuclear detonator.
This had no civil application. The only conclusion we could reach is that this was part of a plan to develop at least the capability to be able to build this part for a nuclear weapons program.
For years, the Iranian government has failed to live up to its obligations under the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty. It has violated its commitments to the International Atomic Energy Agency. It has ignored UN Security Council resolutions. And while Iran's leaders hide behind outlandish rhetoric, their actions have been deeply troubling.
إذا ما ثبت أن هناك برنامج نووي عسكري إيراني فنحن نرى أن هذا البرنامج يمثل تهديدا للاستقرار في الشرق الأوسط، لأنه سوف يدفع بأطراف جديدة للدخول في المجال النووي العسكري.
While Iran poses a threat to countries across the region, one nation has been singled out above the rest.
اسرائیل یک قده سرطانی است. خب قده سرطانی رو چیکار میکنن؟ غیر از قطع قده چه علاجی میتوان برای او کرد؟
Taking aim once again at Israel, Ahmadinejad told an audience that, quote, this origin of corruption will soon be wiped off the Earth's face.
Once the Iranian missiles are up and running on launching pads in Lebanon, they can reach not just Israel, they can reach Western targets. So we are talking about an expansion of Iran in the entire Eastern Mediterranean region, something that has not happened even during the Cold War under the Soviet threat.
Iranians clashed, shouting death to the dictator, even taking over this police station at one point yesterday.
In scenes similar to 1979, millions of Iranians again took to the streets to voice their dissatisfaction with the rulers of Iran. The IRGC and the Basij were quickly deployed. Tens of thousands were arrested. Several hundred were killed.
مخالفان این کسانی که با این بنا با این حق و حقیقت مخالفت میکنن این فقط همون جفاهن اینا در مقابل چشم شما انشالله نابود خواهند بود.
One of those murdered was Neda Aga Sultan, a music student on the periphery of the demonstrations. Video of her death spread quickly throughout the world via YouTube and other social media.
Whenever I see violence perpetrated on people who are peacefully dissenting, and whenever the American people see that, I think they're rightfully troubled. It's not productive, given the history of U.S.-Iranian relations, to be seen as meddling, the U.S. president meddling in Iranian elections.
Well, the question is, should we have meddled in helping the dissidents of the Soviet Union? What is U.S. policy across the world? It's basically to always stand by the underdogs. At least make a stand, say a word. It is in the interest of the international community and of the United States to lend all the support possible to the democratic movement inside Iran so that this regime will be changed as soon as possible. This is a question. Democracy inside Iran is a question now of international security.
امروز سراسر ایران اسلامی از یک فریاد است و اون مرگ بر امریکا.
In the end, if the international community, if the United States will not form this resistance against the Iranian Khomeini's expansion, it will be too late. We will have to pay a much higher price. I'm talking about the entire humanity paying a much higher price to stop that threat.
Welcome back to the Middle East report. I need to emphasize the fact that President Ahmadinejad is no longer the president of Iran, but this will not alter the ideology or the terrorism nature of the Islamic Republic of Iran. Alan, there we got a real insight really into the Shia Islamic revolution, Iran's involvement in international terrorism that spans not only across the Middle East, but also, like you say, into Africa, into Central and South America, the United States, and also into Europe as well. Isn't it time, really, the world started to wake up to the danger that Iran poses, and particularly her state sponsorship of international terrorism?
There's a very short answer to that. Yes. Clearly, the world knows what is going on. And the question really should be not, is it about time, but rather, why don't they? And here there are a lot of countervailing forces and interests, which we can perhaps go on to later on in the interview.
Sure. So if we look at the IRGC's involvement, how does it support international terrorism? How does it support groups like Hezbollah, Hamas, Palestinian Islamic Jihad, and also supports and has supported, according to a lot of media reports, even Al-Qaeda? Yeah.
I think it's important to realize that the IRGC is not one homogeneous body. The frontline troops are the Al-Quds brigade, and they number something like 12,000 people. These are the ones who are most involved up front in some sorts of activities that we're talking about. But the IRGC is much bigger than that. It has numbers of other parts, including what we talked about before, the Basai, who are more in looking after their internal operations. They also have a huge economic power within Iran. They control the missile and nuclear programs that were referred to in the film. They control vast swathes of industry, chemical refining, construction, and so on. It is estimated that their combined annual revenues are in excess of $12 billion. So they clearly do not have a problem in giving the odd billion or two to Hezbollah and all the other organizations that they are involved with. They also have a parallel army to the Iranian army. And even part of the Iranian army is the IRGC. So they are massive, both in terms of their internal strength, the money, the finance, and their external reach. And what they do for these terrorist organizations is they provide political support, they provide safe havens, they provide, obviously, as you've seen, financial support, military support via weapons, and training. And they will have training camps in Lebanon for Hezbollah, but also other groups that will come to Lebanon. They will have training groups in Iran, training camps in Iran, as I'm sure they do for the opposition in Syria. For the Assad's allies in Syria. So their logistics help, their financial help, their education and training help is very, very significant. And even the stuff that one reads on the internet about how you make bombs and so on, and all that sort of stuff requires money. It was interesting in the trial this week or last week of the Birmingham attempted bombers who arrived late at the EDL meeting, that the judge said that a significant part of what had radicalized them is what they'd read on the internet. It is very likely that Iranian money is somewhere behind that, and also Iranian expertise at creating all this stuff. The weapons that have been intercepted going to Hezbollah, the long-range missiles that have been intercepted by Turkey and also by Israel. Israel bombed some weapons which had been delivered, I think it was from Russia, only recently in Syria, which were destined for Hezbollah. So there is a massive amount of weaponry that is emanating in one way or another from the IR.
Yeah, what surprises me, Alan, is we're probably approaching the 4th anniversary of the Green Wave movement uprising after the Iranian presidential elections back in 2009, in which through the fraudulent elections, I think it was Ahmadinejad came 3rd or 4th on the list of candidates. It's not a democracy there, because only those people who support the regime can actually stand. He was then declared the winner, even though the Iranian people felt that he'd actually lost out, and we saw a huge rise of millions of ordinary Iranians taking to the streets to protest and demand freedom, democracy and liberty. And yet what we saw there was members of the IRGC and their internal so more like a kind of their internal group called the Basijis, really cracking down on the dissidents, and yet the world was silent. Surely that was the time then to prescribe the IRGC as a terrorist organization.
Yeah, I think that would have been a very good time. In fact, it's almost difficult to think of a time that would have been a bad one to prescribe the IRGC. It is to the shame of our government and Western governments generally that they did not mutter a word about the terrible things that were happening in Iran. I can't explain it. Is it a willful desire to bury one's head in the sand? Is it a desire not to offend some sections? Is it the fact that they were just too involved in Afghanistan and Iraq? Maybe it's a combination of all of those things. But whatever it is, it's regrettable, and one has to say it is unprincipled.
And we've also got to understand that Iran plays a huge role in the conflict that Israel has with Palestinian terrorist organizations such as Palestinian Islamic Jihad, who've been responsible for firing a whole range of rockets and missiles into southern Israel. Their sponsorship and training of Hamas, even though they're a Sunni terrorist organization. Of course, their proxy, Hezbollah, in the south of Lebanon, who have something in the range of 40 or 60,000 rockets targeted Israel. So this conflict we're seeing that Israel has with the Palestinians, it's really the Iranians behind the scenes that are stirring all the trouble up. What is the extent of Iranian involvement with Palestinian terrorist organizations that target Israel, but also Israeli diplomats abroad, as we've seen in the last couple of years?
Extensive. It has declared Israel as the #1 enemy, or rather the first #1 enemy, the little Satan. The US is the big and, if you like, the ultimate enemy, and they have identified that they can get to Israel both physically, in terms of all the armaments and training and so on that they're supplying, but also through trying to delegitimize or put money behind delegitimizing campaigns.
And we also know that in Israel's recent conflict against Hamas and Palestinian Islamic Jihad in Gaza in November of 2012, that the Iranians supplied these terrorist organizations with the Pasaji missiles, the Fahaj 6 missile, that was capable of reaching Israel's main popular center, which was Tel Aviv, and even some of those missiles were used to target Jerusalem. So this is something that is incredibly serious and something that not only affects Israel, but also affects Europe. Can you explain to us really the true nature of this organization and how not only is Israel's affected, but also that British interests have been affected in the Middle East, for example, our soldiers in Iraq and also in Afghanistan?
Well, as far as soldiers in Iraq, for example, are concerned, many have been killed by the IEDs, which many of which were the expertise for which and the materials for which came from Iran. Our sailors, I think it was 15 sailors, were kidnapped from the Straits of Hormuz and kept captive for a time. Businessmen have been, British businessmen have been kidnapped and kept hostage by the IRG. So the extent of their activity, as well as what is happening, for example, in this country, via their front, what can be regarded as their shop window, which is the Muslim Human Rights Committee in this country, clearly is their influence spreading directly, its tentacles spreading directly into our country.
And Alan, I recently had a recent visit to New York with my wife, and we both visited the site of Ground Zero. Of course, that was where the 9/11 attacks took place in that very fateful day back in September of 2001. What's come to light is very interesting, having read quite a lot of Melanie Phillips' material and others, certainly the 9/11 Commission, made very, very strong hints, if not suggestions, that there was an alliance between Hezbollah and the IRGC and Al-Qaeda, and that how the 9/11 attacks had the fingerprints of the #1 Iranian terror chief in Madmaknea involved in this attack. Surely if this comes to light and this can be proved as absolute firm evidence, then maybe it gives us a greater understanding that we may have dealt with, or the US government may have dealt with, a threat posed by Al-Qaeda from Osama bin Laden by assassinating him, but we haven't taken out the #1 enemy, which is Iran. And with Iran's continual support for state-sponsored terrorism, there is no way we're going to defeat terrorism until we defeat Iran.
Absolutely right. Absolutely right. Man who was associated with the 9/11 bombings or attack was a guy called Imad Muglia. It's fortunate, I suppose, that he's been assassinated back two years ago.
2008.
2 or 5 years ago. So I think there's clear links between. There's a hell of a lot of circumstantial evidence, but getting proof is a lot more difficult. And that perhaps is why governments are reluctant to move. And even where there is proof, like for example in the case of Hezbollah, which is the Iranian proxy in Lebanon, that they were involved in the Bulgaria bus bombing, the European Union has shown a singular reluctance to move and keeps stalling things, which again is very unprincipled.
Why do you think that the British government and also the European Union haven't followed Canada's lead and Canada's example of prescribing the IRGC as a terrorist organisation?
I think Canada has been extremely courageous and extremely principled. And it's the sort of thing that makes me think, gee, if I didn't live in London, I'd like to live in Canada, because I admire a principled government. And there are so very few. The issue, I think, is one of politics. It is one of in democratic society, trying to satisfy all sections of the population. It's also a factor of fear. It is well known, for example, that France has been very reluctant to prescribe almost any organisation for fear that it will be attacked in France. And it does have a significant size Muslim population, which it has to contend with as part of the electorate. So there's a fear factor as well that comes into it. And then there's all the diplomatic considerations, which only diplomats understand, I must confess, are somewhat beyond my common sense approach to these things.
And one thing we realise is that we've got to realise that really that the Iranians are, and you described a very good analogy of being like the octopus with its tentacles everywhere, but the Saudi king Abdullah described Iran in the WikiLeaks affair as being the head of the snake, and America, if it wants to defeat terrorism, needs to cut the head of the snake off, which is a bit of an irony coming from Saudi Arabia, since they support the Wahhabist form of terrorism and support so many different terrorist organizations around the world anyway. But isn't it essential that for Western governments to make a real stand against the threat of terrorism, and we've seen this on our shores recently with the hideous murder of drummer Lee Rigby, that terrorism is an ever-present threat in the UK, in Europe and around the world. And unless we tackle this at its core, which comes from the Islamic Republic of Iran, then we're only going to see an increase in terrorism. So surely it's in the interests of the protection and the safety of Europe that our politicians and our government get to grips with this and really start tackling Iran's involvement in international terrorism.
whilst I would agree with you, Simon, 100%, some people, perhaps many people, would call me paranoid. They don't see the danger in the same way that we do. They feel that we are being extreme, that there are more moderate ways forward. We would argue, how can you beat extremism by being moderate? Bear in mind that these people don't see themselves as extremists. They see them as the right ones in terms of their eyes. They have the correct interpretation. So that justifies their actions. Yes, it clearly is necessary if we are not going to lose what is now no longer called a war against terrorism, but still remains effectively a war, albeit not a conventional war, against terrorism. And the IRGC are, as you said, and King Abdullah has said, and I've said, the octopus that controls it all, or at least a very significant part of it.
If this campaign that you're involved in, and also the Zionist Federation are involved in trying to get the British government and the European Union to prescribe the IRGC as a terrorist organisation, what difference do you think that will make in countering the Iranian terror threat?
Well, first of all, it will make it illegal for anybody to deal with the Iranian organizations. For example, I understand that the GC controls the BMW franchisee. Okay. Now, even under the sanctions that are imposed on Iran through the UN, through the EU, it's perfectly legal to supply BMWs to Iran. If the IRGC is prescribed, then that becomes an offence. So there'll be a whole range of stuff which will make it considerably more difficult. That means that it's the IRGC's earning capacity through its 12 billion a year is going to be significantly diminished. That will mean it has far less resources to finance all this terrorist activity worldwide. And if we can achieve that, that more than anything will help us begin to fight back against this terrorist onslaught that we are facing within the West and outside the West.
And how can our viewers get involved in this very important and significant campaign to prescribe the IRGC as a terrorist organisation?
Well, there are many things that can be done. For example, one can go to one's MP at their regular surgeries and talk about this issue. One can write to one's MPs or MEPs. But the easiest place to start is to go to the Zionist Federation website, which I understand is up on the screen.
It will be up on, it's up on the screen now, yes.
Yeah, www.zionist.org.uk, and then there will be a link to the banning the Iranian Revolutionary Guard Corps campaign. And there is a petition that is linked to it. And a very easy step to take is for your viewers to look at that petition, and if they feel similarly, to put their name to it.
And also, there was a very good briefing paper on this one by Stephen Hoffman, who works for the Zionist Federation, which based a lot of the program notes thanks to his research.
Great.
So they can also download
the briefing paper.
Download briefing paper, which is very good if you're interested, that is. But also, I think we also have to really kind of understand the nature of this war. What makes things so difficult, Alan, is this perception that we're all at peace, that we're not involved in an actual war, but we are actually involved in a war. Doesn't really feel like it, primarily because our troops have been fighting out in Afghanistan, out in Iraq, and it doesn't really affect us. But we know that the Iranian regime is carrying out a worldwide campaign of terrorism. It's also carrying out a campaign of insurgency around the world, or supporting insurgents groups, and also looking to bring down other governments in the Middle East. And they're fighting bitterly hard now in Syria to prop up Bashar al-Assad's regime, because he's their #1 ally in the Middle East.
Absolutely.
And the whole goal is to establish the Islamic Crescent, Iranian empire across the Middle East, and then export that around the world, which not only threatens Israel, and but it's also a great threat to Muslim Sunni states in the Middle East.
Yes, indeed it is. And one of the issues that they face is if, as the film referred to, Iran becomes a nuclear power, then the drive for nuclearization in the Sunni states, particularly Saudi, is going to be something of great urgency, because they have much to fear. So its malevolent influence spreads both near and far in its desire to achieve hegemony in the Middle East, and then throughout the non-Muslim world.
Yeah, very much so, Alan. I think we come back to the last 2 minutes, but can you explain to our viewers why it's so important that we all wake up, realise the threat not only posed by Iran to Israel and the Jewish people, but also the threat to British and European security by the threat of Iran's support for international terrorism?
The way that terrorism is going to be beaten is by cutting off the fuel that drives it. And the fuel that drives it is obviously an ideology, but even more is the money. Now, terrorism or terrorist activities are relatively cheap, most of them, compared to conventional conflict. But the support and the training and so on, and all the stuff that goes behind it, requires a lot of financing. And all that sort of infrastructure is provided by the IRGC. And all of that can be dramatically slowed by banning that organization.
Alan, sadly, we've come to the end of the program, so I want to thank you very much for being my guest today on the Middle East Report, and I wish you every success in the campaign that you're launching to prescribe the Iranian Revolutionary Guards as a terrorist organization. So
thank you.
And I want to thank you all for watching today's program. Let's face reality that we face an incredible threat of terrorism from the Islamic Republic of Iran. Their support for the Iranian Revolutionary Guards, who are the main vehicle in supporting international terrorist organizations such as Hamas and Hezbollah, and even their support for Al-Qaeda. And we need to wake up and realize that not only Israel and the Jewish people are threatened by Iran, but also we in the Western world, here in Britain and in Europe, face the same threat. So let's wake up, let's contact our MPs, and let's get the IRGC prescribed as an international terrorist organization. And thank you for watching the Middle East Report, and watch this moving song that realizes or shows the true nature of the threat we face from the Islamic Republic of Iran.
رسول أهل العزائم ما دنسوا لي حمانا لو طوقته الضراغم حثالة البغي صارت فأين عهد الحواسم ناسوا بأننا أبات نذود ذود القشاعم نحن الذين وطئنا بالخيل عرش الأعاجم المظالم حتى الأراذيل ساموا رسول أهل العزائم فالقول قول الصوارم كي تسترد المظالم حتى الأراذيل ساموا رسول أهل العزائم نحن الذين بنينا حصوننا من جماجم سقنا حليلات كسرى بالسوق سوق الغنائم رسولنا من صنعنا بناة مجد أكارم رسولنا شمس حق أضاء وجه العوالم المظالم حتى الأراذيل ساموا رسول أهل العزائم فالقول قول الصوارم كي تسترد المظالم حتى الأراذيل ساموا رسول أهل العزائم أنار مشكاة ليل من الضلالات قاتم وصاغ من بعض قوم جيلا مع الفجر قادم فحطموا رأس باغ وذللوا كل ظالم حربا على كل حرب سلما لكل مسالم المظالم حتى الأراذيل ساموا رسول أهل العزائم فالقول قول الصوارم كي تسترد المظالم حتى
vessel is suspected of carrying illegal cargo. You hereby requested to stop.
Vous voyez les lettres, ce sont des marques iraniennes. Ce sont toutes des marques de l'armée iranienne.